Some folks think a clipboard and a vendetta make them sheriff of suburbia. In a Houston enclave where HOA rules choke freer than a lasso, every Texas permit was locked for a legal equipment barn, expecting calm. Wrong. A blood-red Porsche swaggered up, blocking access like a rich kid's tantrum, courtesy of a power-hungry busybody. 3 weeks ago, a legal dispute turned into a showdown so absurd it's Texas folklore. Imagine 15 tons of vintage steel creeping at 3 miles per hour, delivering a masterclass in humility. Who's fool enough to mess with that? This revenge saga's hotter than a chili cook-off. Ready for the pettiest HOA war ever? Smash that like, drop your state, and spill your nuttiest neighbor beef. Can you outdo this loner lunacy? Share this with your posy now. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning when I heard high heels clicking across my gravel driveway like a countdown timer. I looked up from my International Harvester combine to see a woman in her mid-30s strutting toward me in a pink blazer so bright it could probably guide aircraft. Lori Blackwell carried herself like she owned the neighborhood, which in her mind she probably did. As the self-appointed queen of the Willowbrook Estates HOA, she'd made it her mission to turn our community into her personal kingdom of beige mailboxes and regulation heathgrass. The morning air was crisp with that first hint of autumn, perfect for working on machinery. But her arrival changed the entire atmosphere like storm clouds rolling in. "Are you the owner of this industrial facility?" she asked, saying the word facility like it was something toxic. I wiped my hands on a shop rag, trying to stay friendly. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Caleb Monroe. This is my agricultural equipment barn. How can I help you?" She flipped through papers on her metallic clipboard with military precision. "I'm Lori Blackwell, chairwoman of the Willowbrook Estates HOA. We've received complaints about noise, odor, and inappropriate industrial activity. This simply isn't compatible with our community standards." The way she said our community made it clear she considered herself the ultimate authority on what belonged in our neighborhood. I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my voice level. "Ma'am, I have all the proper permits for this operation. Everything here is completely legal and was established before your HOA even existed." Lori's smile could have frozen the Gulf of Mexico. "Legal doesn't always mean appropriate, Mr. Monroe. The smell of diesel fuel and machinery noise is affecting our property values. Perhaps you should consider relocating to a more suitable industrial area." I pulled out my folded permits and showed them to her. "These documents from the county say otherwise. I'm operating within all federal, state, and local regulations." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Maybe surprised that I wasn't immediately apologizing and begging for mercy like her other victims probably did. But then that plastic smile returned and she made notes on her clipboard like she was documenting evidence for a war crimes tribunal. "We'll see about that, Mr. Monroe. The HOA board will be conducting a thorough investigation into this matter. I trust you'll cooperate fully." She turned and walked back to her pristine Porsche, her heels clicking out a rhythm that sounded distinctly like a threat. Sarah came out of the house just as Lori was driving away, wrapping her arms around herself against the morning chill. "Who was that?" she asked, and I could see the worry already starting to form in her eyes. My wife had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found diplomatic solutions to problems. That was Lori Blackwell, our new HOA chairwoman. She thinks my barn is some kind of environmental disaster. Sarah frowned, looking at the perfectly maintained building that housed my equipment. "But you have all the permits. This was here before we even moved to the neighborhood." I pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I've got all the paperwork on my side. How hard could it be to prove I have the legal right to operate here?" Looking back, that might have been the most naive thing I'd ever said in my life. I thought Lori Blackwell was just another suburban busybody who'd back down once she saw my permits and legal documentation. I figured a reasonable conversation with the HOA board would clear everything up and we'd all go back to our quiet lives in our perfect little neighborhood. But what I didn't understand was that I was dealing with someone who managed the HOA like she was running NASA. She just lacked a space shuttle to launch her ego into orbit. The next morning, I discovered exactly how wrong I could be. When I walked out to open my barn and prep my harvester for the day's work, I found Lori's blood-red Porsche parked diagonally across my driveway, completely blocking access to my equipment. On the windshield was an official-looking notice with an HOA seal, maintenance area under investigation, no entry authorized, and there was Lori herself standing next to her car with her arms crossed and that same frozen smile, looking like she was posing for a victory photo. She waved at me with her fingertips, a little gesture that somehow managed to be both friendly and completely menacing at the same time. I stood there in my driveway, coffee mug in hand, staring at this suburban standoff and realizing that my quiet life in Willowbrook Estates had just become a war zone. The next 72 hours turned into the longest weekend of my life. Every morning I'd walk out hoping to find my driveway clear, and every morning that red Porsche would be sitting there like a monument to petty tyranny. Lori had essentially declared war on my livelihood, and she was winning through pure, stubborn audacity. I tried everything. Phone calls that went straight to voicemail, knocks on her door that went unanswered. Even though I could see her TV flickering through the curtains, even polite notes left under her windshield wipers explaining that I had farmers depending on me to harvest their crops. Nothing worked. She'd found the perfect weapon against me, my own property. By Thursday, I was getting desperate. The weather forecast was calling for storms, and I had 3 contracts lined up that were going to be impossible to fulfill if I couldn't get to my equipment. That's when my neighbor Tom Whitman showed up at my door with information that changed everything. Tom was a retired property lawyer who'd moved to Willowbrook after 30 years of dealing with exactly these kinds of disputes in downtown Houston from household officials. He was the kind of guy who read legal documents for entertainment and could spot a fraudulent HOA claim from 3 blocks away. "Caleb, we need to talk about your Lori problem," Tom said, settling into my kitchen with a cup of Sarah's coffee. "I've been doing some research, and what she's doing to you isn't new. She's got a pattern." He pulled out a folder filled with papers and photographs. Last year, she went after Mike Henderson's kids for their basketball hoop. Made their life hell for 6 months until they finally gave up and took it down. Before that, it was the Patel family's vegetable garden. She declared it a commercial agricultural operation and threatened daily fines until they tore it out. I leaned forward, suddenly very interested. "So I'm not her first target." Tom shook his head grimly, not even close. "But here's what's different about your situation. You've got something the others didn't. You've got actual legal permits and commercial rights that predate the HOA. Tom explained that Lori had been systematically targeting anyone who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection, but she'd always picked battles she could win through intimidation and harassment. "The thing is," he continued, "she's not acting out of pure malice. She genuinely believes she's protecting the community from chaos and decline. In her mind, your barn represents everything that could go wrong with the neighborhood. Industrial noise, property value decline, the breakdown of residential order. She sees herself as the thin blue line between civilization and suburban apocalypse." That afternoon, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of leaving notes or making phone calls, I walked directly to Laura's front door and rang the bell until she answered. When she finally opened the door, she was wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. For just a moment, she looked almost human, like someone you might actually be able to reason with. "Mrs. Blackwell, I need to talk to you about this situation," I said, keeping my voice calm and respectful. "I understand you have concerns about my operation, but I've got farmers depending on me to get their crops harvested before the storm hits. Real people's livelihoods are at stake here." She leaned against her doorframe, and I could see her mentally shifting back into her HOA chairwoman persona. "That's not my problem, Mr. Monroe. You chose to operate an industrial business in a residential neighborhood. The consequences of that decision are yours to deal with, not mine." There was something cold and calculating in her expression that made me realize this wasn't really about HOA rules or community standards. This was about power. Her power over me, over the neighborhood, over anyone who challenged her authority. "Look, I tried again. I'm willing to work with you on this. Maybe we can set up some kind of schedule, or I can make modifications to reduce any impact on the community." But Lori just shook her head with that same frozen smile. "The only solution is for you to relocate your industrial operation to an appropriate zone. Until you do that, This situation is going to continue. She started to close the door, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Monroe, you might want to check your mailbox. I filed some paperwork that I think you'll find very interesting. The door clicked shut, leaving me standing on her porch with a growing sense of dread in my stomach. I walked back home and found Sarah waiting for me in the kitchen holding a certified letter with the seal of Harris County Court. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking slightly as she handed me the envelope. It came about an hour ago, she said quietly. Caleb, what's happening to us? I tore open the envelope and felt my heart sink as I read the legal documents inside. Lori hadn't just been sitting around waiting for me to give up. She'd been building a case against me. She was requesting a court injunction to shut down my operation, claiming I was operating an illegal industrial facility in a residential zone and posing environmental and safety hazards to the community. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 a.m., 3 days to prepare a legal defense against someone who'd clearly been planning this attack for weeks. I looked at Sarah, saw the fear and uncertainty in her eyes, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just about my business anymore. It was about our home, our family, our right to live peacefully in our own community. Sarah, I said, pulling her close, I need you to know that I'm not going to let her destroy what we've built here. Whatever it takes, however far I have to go, I'm going to stop her. But even as I said the words, I could hear Lori's Porsche starting up outside, and I knew she was just getting started with her campaign to run me out of Willowbrook Estates. The certified letter felt like a lead weight in my hands as I read through Lori's legal complaint for the third time. She was accusing me of operating an illegal industrial facility, creating environmental hazards and endangering community safety. The language was professional and convincing, full of phrases like toxic emissions, heavy machinery risks, and residential property contamination. If I didn't know better, I'd think she was describing some kind of chemical plant rather than a legitimate agricultural equipment business with all the proper permits. Sunday morning brought the call I'd been dreading from Jim Crawford, the farmer whose corn crop was sitting in the field waiting for harvest. Caleb, I hate to pressure you, but the Weather Service just upgraded the storm warning. We're looking at possible hurricane conditions by Tuesday night. If we don't get that corn out of the ground in the next 48 hours, I'm facing a complete loss. His voice cracked slightly, and I could hear the desperation he was trying to hide. I've got 3 generations of farming invested in this land. I can't afford to lose this crop. I stared out my kitchen window at Laura's Porsche, still parked across my driveway like a red middle finger pointed directly at my life. Jim, I'm going to court tomorrow morning to fight an injunction. If I win, I'll have your corn out by tomorrow night. If I lose, I couldn't finish the sentence, but we both knew what it meant. Jim would lose his crop, I'd lose my business, and Lori Blackwell would have won another victory in her campaign to reshape Willowbrook Estates according to her vision. That afternoon, I sat in my home office, surrounded by law books borrowed from Tom Whitman and legal documents I'd printed from the county website. Sarah brought me sandwiches and coffee, her face tight with worry. Our 8-year-old son, Tyler, kept peeking around the corner, sensing the tension in the house, but not understanding what was happening. Daddy, why can't you use your big machines? He asked during one of his reconnaissance missions. I pulled him onto my lap, trying to find words that would make sense to a child. There's a lady who thinks Daddy's machines are too noisy for our neighborhood, so I have to go talk to a judge and prove that I have permission to keep them here. Tyler frowned, processing this information with the serious expression he got when he was really thinking hard. But you help farmers grow food. That's important. Out of the mouths of babes. The more I researched, the more I realized how carefully Lori had constructed her case. She documented every complaint, photographed every oil stain, and recorded noise levels at different times of day. She'd even gotten statements from other residents about the impact of my operation on their quality of life. It was thorough, professional, and completely one-sided. But as I dug deeper into the legal precedents, I began to see weaknesses in her argument. Texas property law is very clear about grandfathered rights and the protection of agricultural operations. The key was proving that my business was established before the HOA rules were created, and that all my permits were valid and current. Monday morning arrived gray and threatening with the smell of rain in the air and storm clouds building on the horizon. I put on my best suit, the one I'd worn to my father's funeral 2 years earlier, and gathered my files. Sarah kissed me goodbye at the front door, her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to shed. "You're going to win this," she said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "You're fighting for what's right, and that has to count for something." Tyler hugged my legs and looked up at me with complete faith that Daddy could fix anything. I wished I felt as confident as my family seemed to think I should. The drive to the Harris County Courthouse took me past Laura's house, and I couldn't help but notice that her Porsche wasn't in the driveway. She was probably already at the courthouse preparing for her moment of triumph. As I parked and walked toward the building, I caught sight of her near the entrance, talking to a man in an expensive suit who was probably her lawyer. She looked confident and composed, like someone who was absolutely certain she was about to win. When she saw me, she smiled and gave me that same little finger wave she'd used from beside her car. It was a gesture that somehow managed to be both friendly and threatening at the same time. Inside the courthouse, I found the right courtroom and took a seat in the back, watching as other cases were called and resolved. Judge Richardson looked like he'd been handling disputes like this for decades, tired but fair with sharp eyes that didn't miss much. When my case was finally called, I walked to the front of the room with my heart pounding and my mouth dry. Everything I'd worked for, everything my family depended on, was about to be decided in the next hour. Behind me, I could feel Lori's presence like a cold wind, and I knew she was probably already planning her victory celebration. But she'd made one crucial mistake in her campaign against me. She'd assumed I was just another suburban pushover who would fold under pressure. She was about to learn that some people fight back when cornered, especially when they're fighting for their family's future. Judge Richardson called the courtroom to order, and I felt the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders like a lead blanket. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and clinical. Behind me, I could hear Lori whispering to her attorney, probably going over last-minute strategy. When I turned around, I saw she'd brought her metallic clipboard and was wearing a navy business suit that screamed professional competence. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she looked like she was ready to argue a case before the Supreme Court. "This is the matter of Blackwell versus Monroe," Judge Richardson announced, adjusting his glasses. "Mrs. Blackwell, you're requesting an injunction against Mr. Monroe's agricultural operation. Please state your case." Laura's attorney stood up smoothly, a young man in a suit that probably cost more than most people's car payments. "Your Honor, my client represents concerned residents of Willowbrook Estates who are being subjected to industrial pollution and safety hazards in their residential neighborhood. Mr. Monroe is operating heavy machinery, storing diesel fuel, and creating noise levels that violate community standards. I watched him present his case with practiced confidence, showing photographs that made my barn look like some kind of environmental disaster zone. Close-ups of oil stains, images of machinery taken from angles that made everything look menacing, and oversized shots of my property that somehow made a legitimate agricultural operation look like a toxic waste facility. The residents of Willowbrook Estates have a right to peaceful enjoyment of their homes without industrial contamination," he continued, gesturing toward a stack of documents. "We have noise measurements, air quality concerns, and testimony from multiple residents about the negative impact on their quality of life." When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and walked to the podium, carrying my folder of permits and legal documents. My hands were shaking slightly, but my voice was steady. "Your Honor, I'm not a lawyer, but I am a man who believes in following the law and doing things the right way." I opened my folder and pulled out the commercial storage variance I'd obtained 3 years earlier. "I have a valid permit issued under Section 12B of the Texas Private Property Code. I have environmental compliance certificates from the County Health Department. I have documentation showing that my operation was legally established before the Willowbrook Estates HOA even existed. But more importantly, I continued finding my rhythm. This case isn't really about environmental concerns or community standards. It's about someone using their position of power to settle personal vendettas." I could see Lori shifting uncomfortably in her seat. "Mrs. Blackwell has systematically targeted residents who don't conform to her vision of suburban perfection. She forced one family to remove their children's basketball hoop. She made another family destroy their backyard vegetable garden. And now she's trying to destroy my livelihood because I won't surrender to her intimidation tactics." Judge Richardson leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. Mrs. Blackwell, is it true that you've been preventing Mr. Monroe from accessing his own property? Lori stood up, her composure cracking slightly for the first time. Your Honor, I was conducting a legitimate safety inspection of what appeared to be an illegal industrial operation. As chairwoman of the HOA board, I have a responsibility to protect our community from potential hazards. The judge's eyebrows rose. And you believe that parking your personal vehicle across someone's driveway was the appropriate way to conduct this inspection? The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. Let me understand this correctly, Judge Richardson continued, his voice taking on a tone that made everyone pay attention. You're telling me that a Porsche 911 is somehow official HOA safety equipment? A few people in the gallery actually chuckled, and I saw Lori's face flush red with embarrassment and anger. Furthermore, you're asking this court to grant an injunction against a man who has all the proper permits, all the required certifications, and all the legal documentation to operate his business simply because you personally don't approve of agricultural equipment in your neighborhood. I felt a surge of hope as I watched the judge's reaction. He was clearly not impressed with Lori's tactics or her attorney's arguments. The law was on my side, and Judge Richardson could see through the smoke screen of environmental concerns and community standards to the real issue: abuse of power. Mr. Monroe, he said, turning to me, your operation was legally established before the HOA rules were implemented. I nodded and handed him copies of my original permits. Yes, Your Honor. My barn was built in 2019, and the Willowbrook Estates HOA wasn't established until 2021. My operation is grandfathered under existing property rights. The judge examined the documents carefully, then looked directly at Lori with an expression that could have melted steel. Mrs. Blackwell, you're asking this court to override legally established property rights based on HOA rules that were created after Mr. Monroe's operation was already in place. That's not how the law works in Texas. His gavel came down with finality. I'm denying the request for an injunction. Mr. Monroe's operation is legally permitted and properly documented. Mrs. Blackwell, you and any associates are hereby ordered to immediately cease blocking access to Mr. Monroe's property. Any further interference will result in criminal charges. As I gathered my papers and prepared to leave, I caught sight of Lori's face and felt a chill run down my spine. The look in her eyes wasn't defeat or embarrassment. It was pure, concentrated rage mixed with something that looked almost like panic. Someone who'd built their entire identity around being in control had just been publicly humiliated and legally defeated. I realized that winning in court might have been the easy part because people like Lori Blackwell don't just accept defeat and walk away quietly. They double down. They escalate and they make things personal. And as I would discover the next morning, my legal victory had only made her more desperate and infinitely more dangerous. The drive home from the courthouse should have felt like a victory lap, but instead I had this nagging feeling that I was driving straight into the eye of a hurricane. Judge Richardson's order had been crystal clear. Lori had to remove her car and stop interfering with my property immediately. But as I turned onto my street, I could see that legal victories and actual compliance were two very different things. What had started as one woman's petty power trip had somehow evolved into what looked like a neighborhood uprising. There were now 6 vehicles clustered around my barn. The original red Porsche, plus a white minivan, 2 SUVs, a pickup truck, and a small sedan I didn't recognize. Folding chairs had been arranged in a semicircle, and I counted at least 10 people milling around with homemade signs and banners. Protect our community values, stop industrial pollution, and most absurdly, save our children from toxic machinery. Lori had somehow managed to turn my legal agricultural operation into a public health crisis, complete with what appeared to be a neighborhood protest camp. The scene was surreal, like someone had decided to hold a suburban revolution in my front yard. There was a pink picnic table loaded with bottled water and snacks, matching lawn chairs arranged like they were hosting a book club meeting, and even a small portable canopy for shade. Lori stood in the center of it all, wearing a bright yellow safety vest over her business suit, holding a laminated copy of what looked like HOA bylaws. She transformed herself from defeated litigant to community organizer in the span of a few hours. I parked in my driveway and walked over to the group, trying to keep my temper under control, despite the fact that my hands were shaking with anger. Ladies and gentlemen, I just came from court where a judge ordered this blockade to end immediately. You're all trespassing on private property and you need to leave now. But instead of dispersing, the group actually seemed to close ranks around Lori. I recognized a few faces. Neighbors I'd waved to but never really talked to. People who probably knew nothing about agricultural equipment or property law, but had been convinced they were protecting their families from some kind of environmental disaster. Mr. Monroe, Lori announced in a voice loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. This is now a legitimate community safety action. We're not leaving until you agree to relocate your dangerous industrial operation away from our homes and families. There was something different about her demeanor, a manic energy that hadn't been there before. The court defeat hadn't broken her. It had transformed her into something more desperate and therefore more dangerous. The judge just ruled that my operation is completely legal, I said, pulling out my copy of the court order. If you don't move your vehicles right now, I'm calling the police. That's when Lori smiled, a cold, calculating expression that made my blood freeze. Please do call the police, Mr. Monroe. I've already contacted Channel 11 News about this environmental emergency. They're sending a reporter to document how our community is being threatened by industrial pollution. She gestured toward my barn like it was leaking radioactive waste. I think our viewers deserve to know what kind of toxic hazards they might be living next to. The way she said our viewers made it clear she saw herself as some kind of environmental crusader fighting for truth and justice. What really got to me wasn't just her refusal to accept the court's ruling. It was how she'd managed to turn this into a public relations battle. She'd positioned herself as the concerned community leader, protecting families from industrial dangers, while making me look like some kind of environmental villain who was poisoning the neighborhood. Some of the protesters were actually buying into it, asking questions about air quality and soil contamination with genuine worry in their voices. She'd weaponized their fear and turned my own neighbors against me. I went inside and called Tom Whitman, my hands still shaking with frustrated anger. She's not backing down, Tom. She's got a whole protest camp set up, and she's claiming it's some kind of environmental emergency. Tom was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him thinking through the implications. Caleb, I think you need to understand what's really happening here. Lori's not just fighting you anymore. She's fighting for her entire identity. Being HOA chairwoman is the only power she has left, and if she backs down now, she loses everything that makes her feel important. The Weather Service just updated their storm warning, Tom continued. You've got maybe 18 hours before this system hits the coast. If you can't get to your equipment, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Jim Crawford's corn crop would be destroyed, along with my reputation and my business. I looked out my window at the circus in my front yard and felt something fundamental shift inside me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was coldly, calculatedly determined. Tom, I need you to look up the exact wording of Texas property law regarding emergency access to agricultural equipment during severe weather warnings. After I hung up, I walked out to the old barn behind my house, the one I rarely used because it was too small for my main equipment. Sitting there under a dusty tarp was my 1982 International Harvester Combine, 15 tons of vintage American steel that I'd been restoring as a hobby project. I'd gotten her running last month just to see if the old girl still had life in her. As I looked at that machine, I felt my resolve crystallize into something unshakable. Lori Blackwell had pushed me to my absolute limit, and she was about to learn that some people don't stay down when they're cornered. She'd turned this into a war, and I was finally ready to show her what happens when you declare war on a farmer in Texas. The sound of the old International Harvester roaring to life was like thunder rolling across the neighborhood. 15 tons of vintage American steel in engineering with an engine that had been designed to work through anything Mother Nature or stubborn humans could throw at it. I'd spent an hour getting her ready, checking hydraulic fluid, testing the transmission, making sure every safety system was functioning perfectly. This wasn't just about accessing my barn anymore. It was about sending a message that some lines should never be crossed. I climbed into the cab and felt the familiar vibration of serious horsepower beneath me. The old girl might have been 4 decades old, but she still had the heart of a lion and the stubbornness of a Texas mule. As I engaged the transmission and started moving toward the front of my property, I could see Lori's protest camp through the windshield. The approaching rumble of the harvester was having exactly the effect I'd hoped for. People were looking around nervously, trying to figure out where that earth-shaking noise was coming from. When I came around the corner of my house, the sight of that massive combine must have been quite a shock to Lori's little revolution. I wasn't moving fast, maybe 3 miles per hour, but 15 tons of moving steel has a way of commanding attention and respect. The protesters scattered like startled birds, grabbing their signs and folding chairs as they backed away from what suddenly seemed like a very small barn. But Lori stood her ground, positioned directly in front of her Porsche, like she was protecting it from an approaching avalanche. The expression on her face was priceless, a mixture of disbelief, outrage, and just a hint of genuine fear as she realized that her suburban protest had just escalated into something she hadn't planned for. For the first time since this whole confrontation started, Lori Blackwell looked like she wasn't completely in control of the situation. I brought the harvester to a stop about 20 feet from the barn and shut off the engine. The sudden silence was almost as dramatic as the noise had been. I climbed down from the cab, my boots hitting the ground with purpose, and walked toward the group with deliberate calm. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to access my property to retrieve agricultural equipment for an emergency harvest operation. There's a severe storm approaching, and people's livelihoods depend on getting crops out of the field before it hits. My voice was steady and professional, but there was steel underneath it that made everyone pay attention. Several of the protesters were already edging toward their cars, clearly having second thoughts about their involvement in what had suddenly become a much more serious confrontation. But Lori wasn't backing down. If anything, she seemed energized by the challenge, drawing herself up to her full height and pointing at the harvester like it was some kind of weapon of mass destruction. "You can't intimidate us with that machine," she shouted, her voice cracking slightly with stress and adrenaline. "This is a peaceful protest protecting our community from environmental hazards." I had to admire her courage, even if her logic was completely twisted. "Mrs. Blackwell, you're trespassing on private property in violation of a direct court order. That harvester isn't a weapon. It's a tool I need to save a farmer's crop from the storm." That's when Officer Davis arrived, responding to what must have been multiple emergency calls flooding the police dispatch. He was a veteran cop who'd probably seen every kind of suburban drama imaginable. But even he seemed taken back by the scene confronting him. A massive vintage combine harvester, a protest camp with pink picnic tables, and a woman in a safety vest standing defiantly in front of a red Porsche. It was like something out of a surreal comedy sketch directed by someone with a very twisted sense of humor. "Folks, I need everyone to calm down and explain what's happening here," Officer Davis said, positioning himself between me and the remaining protesters. I handed him my copy of the court order, along with documentation of my emergency harvest contract. "Officer, I have a legal ruling that orders these people to stop blocking access to my property. I need to get to my barn to retrieve equipment for a time-sensitive agricultural operation." Officer Davis read through the documents carefully, then looked at the protesters with the expression of someone who was rapidly losing patience. "Ma'am," he said to Lori, "do you have any legal authority to block this man's access to his own property?" Lori launched into what sounded like a prepared speech about community safety and environmental protection, but Officer Davis cut her off with a gesture. "Ma'am, I need a simple yes or no answer. Do you have legal authority to block this driveway?" The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since this whole confrontation began, Lori Blackwell looked like she didn't have a ready answer. "We're conducting a legitimate community safety protest," she finally said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried just minutes earlier. Officer Davis shook his head. "Ma'am, this gentleman has a court order that says his operation is legal and that you're required to stop interfering with his property access. If you don't move your vehicle immediately, I'll have to arrest you for obstruction of justice and contempt of court." I could see the exact moment when Lori realized she'd pushed her luck too far. The protest camp that had seemed so powerful just an hour earlier suddenly looked like what it really was. A bunch of neighbors who'd been manipulated into trespassing on someone else's property. She looked at her Porsche, then at the massive harvester, then back at Officer Davis, and I could practically see the calculations running through her head. Finally, with her face flushed red with embarrassment and anger, she stalked over to her car and yanked open the door. "This isn't over, Monroe," she said through gritted teeth as she started the engine. "I'll be filing complaints with every agency I can think of." But as she backed out of my driveway, I could see her hands shaking on the steering wheel, and I knew that something fundamental had changed in the balance of power between us. The rest of the protesters melted away like snow and Texas sunshine once Lori's Porsche disappeared around the corner. Within 15 minutes, my property was quiet again, except for the distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm. I looked at my vintage harvester, then at my finally accessible barn, then at Officer Davis, who was shaking his head with what looked like a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "Sir, in 23 years of police work, I've never seen anyone resolve a property dispute with a combine harvester," he said, "but I have to say it was effective." As I finally opened my barn and started preparing my equipment for the emergency harvest, I couldn't help but smile. The international harvester that had been my restoration hobby had just become the hero of the hour. But something told me this wasn't really over. Someone who'd gone to such lengths to maintain control wasn't going to simply accept defeat and disappear quietly. And I was right to be concerned, because the next morning brought a phone call that would turn this entire situation into something I never could have expected. The call came from Jennifer Martinez at Channel 11, news at 6:30 in the morning, while I was drinking coffee and watching weather reports about the storm that was finally making landfall. "Mr. Monroe, I understand you had quite a confrontation yesterday with your homeowners association," she said, and I could hear the excitement in her voice that reporters get when they smell a compelling story. "I've been doing some research on Mrs. Blackwell, and I think our viewers would be very interested in hearing your side of what happened." What Jennifer had discovered was fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. It turns out this isn't the first time Mrs. Blackwell has been involved in disputes with her neighbors, she explained. In fact, she's been the subject of 17 formal complaints filed with the county about abuse of her HOA position, harassment, intimidation, selective enforcement of rules, misuse of association funds. The list goes on and on. But yesterday's confrontation with your harvester seems to have been the final straw. The news story aired that evening, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone started ringing with calls from neighbors expressing support, farmers offering to help if I needed equipment, and even reporters from other stations wanting to follow up on the story. But more importantly, the story had apparently reached the people who mattered most. Tom Whitman called me around 9 o'clock with news that changed everything. "She's finished, Caleb," Tom said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. The HOA board held an emergency meeting tonight and voted unanimously to remove Lori from her position as chairwoman. They're also issuing a formal apology to you for the harassment you've endured. I felt a mixture of relief and vindication wash over me. What happens now? Well, the board has asked me to take over as interim chairman until the next election. And my first official act is going to be to make sure your agricultural operation is explicitly protected in the HOA bylaws. Over the next few weeks, I watched as Lori's carefully constructed world came crashing down around her. The news story had opened the floodgates, and other residents began speaking out about their experiences with her authoritarian management style. Story after story emerged of petty harassment, selective rule enforcement, and systematic abuse of power. The Henderson family described the stress of having their children's basketball hoop declared a neighborhood safety hazard. The Battelle family talked about being forced to destroy their backyard vegetable garden because Lori had classified it as an unauthorized commercial agricultural operation. The final nail in the coffin came when the county auditor announced an investigation into the HOA's finances. Apparently, Lori had been using association funds to pay for her security consultants and other questionable expenses related to her various feuds with residents. The audit revealed thousands of dollars in unauthorized expenditures, all designed to support her personal vendettas against neighbors who dared to challenge her authority. And within a month, Lori had quietly put her house up for sale and moved back to Austin to live with her sister. The red Porsche was one of the last things to go. I saw it on the back of a carrier truck one morning, being hauled away like the final piece of evidence from a crime scene. It was a fitting end to her reign of suburban terror. And I have to admit, I felt a certain satisfaction watching it disappear down the street. Today, 3 months after the Great Harvester confrontation, life in Willowbrook Estates has returned to something resembling normal. Tom Whitman was elected as the new HOA chairman in a landslide victory, and he's eliminated 14 of the most ridiculous rules that Lori had imposed during her time in power. The Henderson kids have their basketball hoop back. The Patel family has replanted their garden, and I've never received another complaint about my agricultural operation. Yesterday, my son Tyler asked me, "Dad, are you going to flatten any more cars with the harvester?" I laughed and pointed to the new sign I'd installed outside my barn. Private property, no Porsches allowed. He grinned and ran off to tell his friends about his dad's famous harvester battle, turning our family drama into playground legend. Sometimes in Texas, you just have to prove that you're not someone to mess with, and sometimes a 15-ton combine harvester is exactly what you need to remind people about the importance of respecting other people's property rights and following the law. Lori Blackwell learned that lesson the hard way, but I like to think the experience made her a better person in the long run. She probably tells a very different version of the story to anyone who will listen, but that's human nature for you. As for me, I'm back to doing what I love, helping farmers get their crops harvested and keeping the agricultural machinery of Texas running smoothly. And if anyone else wants to challenge my right to do that, well, they know where to find me. I'll be in the barn maintaining my equipment and living the American dream, one harvest at a time.